Hello, like to welcome you back to our series of Fireside Chats. This is the August edition, and we're starting our fall series, and so we'll have a monthly Fireside Chat every month through to December. And I'm really happy to be back doing these. We took a couple of months of vacation, badly needed vacation for both me and our production group. For those of you that are sort of new to either the Fireside Chat or to the Design of Experiments course, let me tell you a little bit about this. I'm sort of channeling President Roosevelt with these Fireside Chats. President Franklin D. Roosevelt conducted monthly Fireside Chats by radio to everybody in the United States from 1933 until 1944. That's a long period of time. I don't know that we'll be doing them for 10 years or 12 years, but we'll see how it goes. But I try to arrange to have a guest speaker every month, and I always try to find somebody that can talk about interesting topics or applications of experimental design concepts. And we always leave some time for Q&A. And you can ask questions during the Fireside Chat by using the chat feature in Zoom, and you can also send them in advance. And we always try to answer these questions on air. If we can't get them done on air, then we'll try to figure out how to get the answer to you afterwards. All of these Fireside Chats are recorded. And you can find not only this one, but you can find all of the previous ones that we've done in the resources tab of your Coursera course. I think I've got a great lineup of speakers for the next few months, and I'm sure you're going to really enjoy the topics that these people have to share with us. So just a couple of quick reminders. Please, keep your mics muted so that we don't have any extraneous noise in the system. And as I mentioned, if you want to submit a question for either me or for the guest, you can do that using the chat function in Zoom. You don't need to wait until the Q&A ends. You can put your question in anytime you'd like. And as I mentioned, if we don't get it answered during this time period, we will get it into the Coursera course for those of you who are taking that. Our guest today is Dr. Sarah Burke. Sarah is an analyst at the ProDugo Group, a linguist company, and Sarah supports the Scientific Test and Analysis Techniques Center of Excellence for the last 5 years. And she works with the Department of Defense acquisition programs to help plan and analyze experiments. She received a BS in mathematics from the University of Vermont and an MS in statistics and PhD in industrial engineering from ASU. And full disclosure here, Sarah is one of my former PhD students. She is a member of and a volunteer for both the American Statistical Association and the American Society for Quality. And she has a wide range of research interests, design of experiments, including response surface methods, quality control, statistical engineering, multi-criteria decision-making, and she has some really interesting hobbies. She's a great baker, and she's actually used some statistical methods in some of her baking work. And she's a film noir addict. Okay, she knows more about classic film than anybody I've ever met. So with that, I think I should turn this over to Sarah, and she's going to talk about a really interesting topic in experimental design in the defense acquisition world.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug, for that kind welcome. And thanks for inviting me for this fireside chat. Happy to be here after the summer vacation. But no pressure for me, right?
Right.
So I'm going to share my screen and should be good to go. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit lessons learned from some testing that I supported with the Stat COE. We're an organization that supports test planning and analysis for Department of Defense acquisition program. So we're sort of outside consultants for these programs to help them test better as they're developing these new systems. So my talk today is a bit of a mix of practical advice with some technical mixed in as well. So this is about some testing that we helped plan and analyze for a life support system for military fast jets. So, some of the advice, hopefully, that I'll impart with you today isn't always technical, and that's one of the most important things to keep in mind, particularly when you're trying to implement something like design of experiments with other practitioners that are not as well versed in DOE. Some of the considerations you need to take in mind so you have a successful outcome. So go ahead and get started. So a little bit of background on what this system was. So this is a life support system. So if you're not familiar with jets at all, if you're a pilot, you need to make sure that you have as you're flying your system in operation. And so we were asked, or tasked, I should say, to help plan and execute testing of a life support system in a lab. So we weren't on the actual system. This was a lab-based testing that didn't involve a pilot. So we had unmanned testing to help characterize performance of this system across different operating conditions. And so the life support system itself has many different components to it. And so here's just a little bit of a picture to get a feel for the application. So you've got the oxygen concentrator here. This is where the oxygen actually comes from. It comes through and it gets mixed in with this plenum. And then it goes through to this regulator, which actually delivers the oxygen to the pilots. And so it goes through this hose and then up into the mask where the pilot will actually receive the oxygen. And so this is all embedded into the actual system. Here's a little bit about the STAT COE. So this organization is funded by the Department of Defense. And so one of the things that we've actually created or developed is this, what we call our STAT process. And this figure here, you'll see is sort of a flow chart of basically the basic test process in general. But what we've tried to do when we work with the programs and customers that we support is try to inject some statistical rigor into the testing. And so we've got this divided into planning, how you set up your test, understand all the important factors there, the actual design, so what experiment, what's the test matrix actually look like, test execution, which we usually don't get involved with, that usually gets handed off to the operators, they execute the test, and then they bring the data back to us to analyze, right? So one thing that you might notice is we always have this starting point of, well, you have to start with some sort of requirement about your system, some performance metric or specification that has to get proved, right? And then you go through this very long planning process. So one thing I always point out when I'm working with a customer is notice how large this planning box is in relation to the other elements. So the design part, which is what you focus on, right, in the DOE class, is just a small piece of that. And then the analysis is also a small piece. Planning is so much more important. And I think that's one of the big lessons that hopefully you'll take away today is doing proper planning so that you set up your test and your design for success in the analysis, because the whole point is to get data to help support some sort of decision, right? You want to make a decision based on the data you've collected. Right? So you want your test to make sure it provides you that data so that you can answer those questions. Okay, and so this is all on our STAT website. I will point out STAT in the DoD isn't statistics, it's scientific test and analysis techniques. The DoD loves acronyms. So this is encompassing many different statistical methods, such as design of experiments. That's our gold standard when we can actually use it. So in particular with this life support testing, we worked with a team, and there wasn't really a clear requirement for this system. The whole goal was to be able to overall characterize the performance of what's called the onboard oxygen generation system, which is a subset of the life support system in the jet. Right, and so the STAT COE was actually involved with 2 testing efforts, and we actually have a third one that's just started up. So we've had a lot of good success with the teams that we've worked with. But the first one was our first interaction. as a statistician or analyst, perhaps you're familiar with Tukey's quote, you get, the best part of being a statistician is getting to play in everyone's backyard. And so that's definitely the case here. So this was our first chance working with the OBOGs and understanding what the system actually was. So I'll highlight a lot of lessons learned from this first effort and how we were able to apply it later on as we continued testing. And the big thing here is this was done in a laboratory. So we had fixed conditions and a lot more control over the different test conditions. And it was unmanned. So we were able to simulate human breathing in this laboratory, so we were able to still be able to characterize the performance of the OBOGs across different metrics. And I'll talk about some of the different factors and responses that we looked at. Okay, so here's sort of a summary of this testing effort. And we had our test objective, well, we want to characterize the performance. That was pretty clear from the get-go with all of our stakeholders. But what are some of the factors and some of the outputs with this system? Well, there's a lot of different factors, particularly in an operational environment, right? So you've got the altitude of your aircraft, you've got the pressure that comes into the oxygen system, that's called the inlet pressure. We've got things related to the human itself. So how fast does a human breathe? That's the breathing rate. And a metric or a variable called the tidal volume, which is basically related to how much your lungs expand on a single breath. So how much are they taking in a single breath? So are you breathing really deeply and really fast, for example, are things to keep in mind. Peak flow is another variable related to human breathing, and I'll talk more about these three variables later on. And then you've got some other just other conditions that you could switch out. So you might have different OBOG systems itself, right? You might have different regulators for the oxygen, and you might have different masks that the pilot is using. So these are all some of the variables or inputs that we wanted to consider and understand, do these affect some of the performance metrics of this life support system? So what outputs did we really care about? Well, there were several. Okay, primarily we were worried or wanted to be able to understand, well, how does the oxygen concentration change across the system? So recall back to that picture that I showed, the flow chart of here's how the oxygen sort of tracks through from the regulator and the OBOGs itself and up to the pilot. Oxygen concentration vary at any of those different points in the kind of system flow. We also wanted to look at the mask pressure. So what pressure was the pilot experiencing, right, directly on the mask? Is that too high, too low? What's the comfort level there? And then we developed another metric called work of breathing, which was aimed at trying to understand, well, based on the way some of these input conditions are, is the pilot having to work really hard to breathe across these different conditions? Okay, so let's dive into some of the lessons learned with this now that we have an understanding of the factors and the system. So like I said, we started off with a first effort, and it was our first chance with the team. And we had a lot of pressure from the program office, our stakeholder, to begin testing as soon as possible, right? And so when we came in to join this team, we're the outside consultants. We're trying to work with engineers and the lab personnel who are very knowledgeable, have a lot of system expertise and just amazing source of knowledge. But they'd never used design of experiments before in any of their previous testing. And they were unfamiliar with a lot of statistical techniques. Their primary method for running test runs in their lab was to recreate conditions in a flight, right? And so they weren't varying or controlling factors in a purposeful way. They just said, well, here's what we saw in an observational event, and we're going to try to replicate that. Well, the downside with that type of approach is now you can't prove any type of causation relationship between changing factors versus the responses. So we came in and we wanted to suggest, well, we should use design of experiments. We have really good control over all the factors, and we'll be able to learn a lot more. And they bought into that. So, but the one thing that we didn't dive as deep on was in that planning step, right? We tout, you got to spend all this time on planning. It's so important, but we got the pressure from the program office. We need results. We need to get testing done. So what happened? One of the factors that we were presented with by the lab personnel was, well, there's this breathing factor, and it's a categorical variable, 4 levels. And it's just profile 1, 2, 3, 4. And we said, okay, great, we will work with that. It's not ideal because, as we know, categorical factors, particularly multi-level ones, drives up your design size typically, makes it harder to interpret. You can't interpolate things, but we said, well, that's the breathing profile, got it, we'll work with it. Well, we found out later, after we've already executed several tests, that the breathing profile was actually two continuous variables related as one categorical. And so this figure on the slide shows that the breathing profile was actually specifying the breathing rate, right, and the peak flow of the pilot. And like I said, this was in a lab setting, and the lab was able to simulate these breathing conditions for the pilot. So it simulated human breathing conditions, but still legitimate. So one thing that you might notice is each of these points represents what the four profilers were, or the profiles of the breathing conditions were, right? And there's obviously a downside here. There's a clear correlation of two factors, right? That's really going to limit any type of analysis if we wanted to try to break this categorical factor into two continuous ones, right? Severely limited the interpretation and a way to show, does breathing rate cause changes in any of these responses, or is it peak flow? We can't distinguish them because the correlation itself is so high, right? Ideally, we'd like to have these corner points executed, right? So this was a clear lesson learned of these were continuous variables that they could actually control in the lab. They could set the breathing rate to any value, and they could set the peak flow to any value based on certain limitations, but they had complete control over these, and we didn't realize that at first. So lesson, make sure you question all of the factors that your subject matter experts provide you, right? And then here's a picture. Actually, there were other labs that did similar testing with the system that we weren't involved in, and you'll notice they all used these breathing profiles, and none of them were consistent in which ones they actually used. And the diamonds actually represent a military standard that recommends what conditions to do. And none of the labs actually executed those points in the standard. So there was a lot of different choices made, and there was inconsistency across choosing the factors levels, particularly for these breathing conditions. All right, so one thing you might notice as well, let me jump back here, is this space is clearly not being executed as a factorial, right? You're not hitting the corner points. Well, there's a reason for that. And it's because humans can't breathe across all of these conditions. It's physically impossible for a human to breathe at high peak flow and a low breathing rate. That's just not humanly possible. So we have a classic case of, I've got these factors, I can control them. It's not just a breathing profile, but I've got constraints in the design region, right? So other examples when you might have design space constraints is, in this case, we had, if I'm at high levels, I'm outside of the region of operability, right? It's not possible for a human to breathe in certain conditions. There's a lot of other reasons why you might have constraints in different industries. So, right, undesired results from factor combinations, or you've got limitations in your testing range, for example. Right, so identifying these constraints early on will help you choose and create a more appropriate test design in that design phase of our stat process. So what do we do if we have design constraints? What type of design should we use? Well, classical design doesn't really work anymore, right? Factorial designs and fractional factorial designs, they really rely on executing corner points. Well, we can't execute corner points, so we rely on optimal design. Right, so we did computer-generated optimal designs to design most of these experiments in this setting. And so this slide here is just as a reference, but we used de-optimal designs because the primary goal was to screen out the unimportant factors. We wanted to be able to identify which factors really matter on all of our responses. So we used a de-optimal, which was it is pretty standard for in practice. Right, so here's a little bit of information about the actual constraint in the human breathing factors. So like I mentioned, they were simulating these breathing conditions in the lab. So how did they do that? Well, they had this machine that simulated breathing using a sine wave. So this is one way to do it. Other labs have other techniques that allow you to have more flexibility, but this is how the lab was capable of simulating this. And so one of my colleagues went and did the math behind the scenes to try to understand, well, how would we measure peak flow and how are the tidal volume all related to? And he developed this constraint, right? So the three breathing variables are all interrelated to each other in this way. And so what we did is we used JUMP to create an optimal design and use the following breathing the constraints, and we filled in these values to determine the limits by consulting with physiologists. So we brought in some other subject matter experts to say, well, what values restrict where we operate in the test space? And so here, this new figure with the black dots represents, well, here's the actual design space that the humans could operate over. And so these were the test points that we suggested to run. And we included a center point so we could test for curvature and see what was going on in the center of the space. Again, the goal was screening. So we really wanted to identify how did the performance change across the space. And this is in particular with the breathing factors. And you'll notice that this space is much larger than what all of the other labs had done. And it's also not the same as what the military standard recommends as well. And so that was one piece where we wanted to provide some additional updates to the standard, which is actually being updated as a result of some of this work. So some of this responses, don't underestimate planning, right? The big issues we had here is one, we accepted a 4-level categorical factor as yes, that was the only option to represent the breathing conditions. And that was not the case, right? So this is my plea, right? When you're working with a test team or a planning team to design an experiment, always question the status quo, right? Don't always just accept this is what we did last time, or this is what, the way we've always done it. It's important to ask those questions, to just say, hey, have you thought about it a different way? And that'll help open up the doors to other potential options. And the other part that we did is when we did our follow-on effort, we brought in a lot more subject matter experts beyond the folks in the lab and ourselves. So we had folks from the program office itself, we had the lab operators, but the really big addition was the physiologists, because they could provide a lot of information about pilots themselves and how they interact with these breathing variables. Just want to make sure I have enough time for all the fun stuff, but so I'm gonna skip a few lessons. So here was some more information about this testing. So the responses from this test were not actually a single point estimate value, right? When we were executing these tests in the lab, what we actually had was a stream of data. So every run in this experiment was executed for 20 minutes, and we changed all of the different factors and variables across this 20 minutes to be able to represent a short test flight, essentially. So one thing to think about is in some of our initial analysis is we looked at what we call landmarks or landmark analysis. So we did the final analysis on, say, the mean response values or the standard deviation or the range and things like that, because we had to get out results fast, and that was quick analysis that we could do. And we still got really good, information and understanding of the important factors, right? But perhaps some of you have experience with robust designs where you want to make sure you're meeting some mean response, but also minimizing the variability, right? So one thing that we saw here a lot was the moments. The mean and the spread told very different stories in the system performance. So here we have a couple of different test runs represented here. And you'll notice that not only does the average or the mean response change from run to run, but the variability is vastly different across each run. And so that was an important thing to take into account, is the mean wasn't the only thing that mattered. And in fact, understanding the standard deviation and the spread was much more important to understanding the system behavior for our stakeholders. Okay, so what else is of interest in this case study here? Well, when I was working on the first effort with this, I was sort of kind of the assistant, right? I was helping out with the analysis and things like that. And, we had to get the results out, and we were doing this landmark analysis, right? So we focused on a lot of different metrics. So we looked at the mean, we looked at a couple of different percentiles, the variance, the range, And we modeled them, using linear regression, function of the factors that we were changing. But the whole time I was like, this is so unsatisfying, this analysis. I'm cutting out and I'm losing so much information. I've got this whole time series of data that I could be analyzing, and there's structure to this data, and I'm ignoring it. And it was very unsatisfying for me. So big lesson learned for our follow-on effort is there are other analysis techniques beyond simple linear regression to handle these types of responses, and we should utilize that. And so that is what we started to do in the second effort. So like analyzing landmarks, right, or the average response or the standard deviation, right, doesn't account for the underlying structure of the response, right? And you're throwing away thousands and thousands of data points in the analysis, right? That's such a waste, right? We're doing this test, we've got a lot of information, and there's a lot of information we'd like to be able to learn from it. So the picture here represents a run from one of the experiments. So we had a 16 run design, right? And so we were changing the factor conditions at each of these different test runs. And you'll notice that the response behavior changes a lot, right, across each of these runs, right? In some cases, you've got very flat performance or not a lot of variability, and there's not a lot of structure there. The means change across some of the runs. And in some cases, you get this very interesting behavior, right? And so how can we account for that in the analysis, right? How do we help inform our subject matter experts more about how these factors are affecting these responses? Because in real life, a pilot's going to have this system and they're going to be flying, right, over time, right? So how can we capture that time element in our analysis and understand the effects of the factors? And so functional data analysis is one option or one way to do that. We'll point out, so functional data analysis, or FDA, because everybody loves acronyms, is not the only way to analyze time series responses like this in a designed experiment. But one of the advantages, again, I'm a practitioner at this point in my career, and so I need tools that I can actually implement to be able to give to my customers. And so JMP introduced, I feel like I'm shilling JMP, some really nice tools available to help us analyze some of these complicated design techniques, right? And FDA is now in JMP, which is really nice. And so a little bit of background on FDA. So what you do is you use this basis function. So for example, you could take simple splines to estimate your response time series, right, to represent your raw data. So you don't just have the messy, noisy data. You try to reduce it down into a more structured element. Right? And then you can use a method of principal components that's built for functional data, right, to be able to model that time series. And so you basically end up with two key pieces. So one is what we call the eigenfunctions, and that helps explain how your responses are changing across time. So as the test run goes over time. And then you have what's called these functional principal component scores, or FPC scores, and they help explain the differences across the actual test run. So getting into how are my factors influencing the responses, right? And how are their changes across each test run, right? And then what you do is you sort of reverse engineer to predict your response, which is a time series. So you've got your overall average, but then you've got this principal component score times an eigenfunction, and then you've got the summation, right? So you end up in a little bit of the principal component world where you might drop out some of these eigenfunctions if they're not explaining a lot of the variability in the response. And so here's a profiler from JMP for one of our responses where you can do the principal components on the functions and then relate it back to your factors. So what you end up doing is you fit a linear regression model on the FPC scores, because that's explaining the differences across the runs. So our new responses are actually the FPC scores. We fit those models as a function of the factors, feed in our prediction, that's why it has a hat over it here, right? And then use those predictions to estimate the response. And so here's a predicted response, right? When we have, say, the low breathing rate, low tidal volume, and low input pressure to the oxygen system, right? And it predicts the actual response curve over time. So this is what we started to do in the second effort, so we could help understand the structure, right? So this is really nice to be able to provide predictions across our flight profiles, across the entire length of our test event, and not just for a static input. So we're not just focused on averages anymore. We're not just focused on standard deviation or range. We can provide predictions across a flight profile, however we define that based on our inputs, right? And so this was particularly applicable for things that for responses that had some sort of underlying pattern behavior, right? But not all of them always had that, right? So this was an interesting lesson as well. So this was really helpful analysis for some of the responses that had that sort of sinusoidal patterns in over time. But some of the responses were, regardless of the factor, the structure of the time series was the same. And so doing the landmark analysis in those cases was perfectly sufficient to learn about the system and to screen out which factors mattered and which ones didn't, right? So in those cases, we still looked at the average or a median value, and then usually the standard deviation, or what we called the swing, which was a variation on the range, to be able to provide inputs and feedback to our customer, right? So these advanced analysis techniques are really helpful, but use it when it makes sense, right? So if you can do simpler analysis and provide the same types of results, simpler is always going to be easier to sell to your customer, right? But don't sacrifice simple for incorrect, right? So in some cases, we really needed to do that more advanced analysis because it provided a lot more information and value, but in some cases not. So balance those two, being able to share your results in a meaningful way, and so that your subject matter experts and your customers understand it and can act on that information, right? So you want to balance information versus the simplicity. Here was an example where the functional data analysis didn't really add too much. So same response, changing the factor conditions, right? There's a little bit more of a pattern in the response, but not nearly as dramatic as the example on the previous slide. So this is one case where we were able to use the more simple analysis techniques to explain the factor effects to our customer, right? But there's a lot of questions with implementing DOE with functional data analysis. So again, I'm a practitioner. I've not done experiments with time series before. This is my first foray into it, so it was really fun. But there's a lot of questions I had, right? So like, what design should I use? I had to use an optimal design because I had constraints on my factors. But are there other design techniques that I should consider, right? How do I size the design, right? How do I know what's enough runs? Do the usual design metrics still make sense, right? I can evaluate a design before I execute it using things like power analysis. I can look at the design orthogonality. But if I know my response is a stream of data time series, do all of those design metrics still make sense? I mean, on one hand, I think yes, because we end up modeling the FPC scores if you use functional data analysis. But if you use another time series analysis technique like wavelets, do the design metrics still make sense? And I don't know the answers to those. So if you guys have experience, I'd love to hear about it. And if you have any other insights of these types of experiments in your work, really interesting topic. And what are the best ways to even model the time series? So we were able to use splines for most of the cases because it worked well enough. There are other options out there, but are there recommendations on, well, with these types of responses or this type of behavior, this type of technique for modeling the response is recommended? And I don't know. So we tried doing it a couple of different ways. We used splines and we used a Fourier series just to see if it made a difference, and it didn't. So we went with a simpler spline, but are there any recommendations there? And then the last question is, I've got this stream of data, it's coming from these sensors in my system. Well, how frequently do the sensors need to collect time points, right, across my time series, right? What frequency is sufficient? It seems like an interesting question. Or how long should I run the time series experiment? How do I know when enough is enough? So those are some open questions. And at least from the digging I had done as we were starting to plan this, is there's not a lot of guidance on this yet, right? So really opens the door to new applications for DOE, particularly in this much more modern era. I mean, DOE started off in the 1920s for agriculture experiments, and now we've got this stream of data from sensors, and that's really common in a lot of different industries. So how does DOE adapt to those types of situations to still get efficient and effective test designs? Okay, so I think I'll wrap there. I'm just at I think my allotted time, but hopefully you saw a couple different lessons learned in this talk. I know it was a case study with an interesting application, but one of the things that I took away from working on this project is that not all of the lessons learned are technical, right? So I've been with the Stats COE for 5 years, came from ASU after working with Dr. Montgomery. So I felt like I had the technical, background to help, but some of the lessons I've learned as being a practitioner and helping customers is you got to think about the non-technical aspects as really with your customers is to make sure you manage expectations and make sure you have clear stakeholders expectations so that they're satisfied and up to date with the work that you're doing, right? And then the last lesson learned or conclusion is, like I mentioned, DOE is an evolving topic, right? So in the DoD, the Department of Defense in particular, we've got a lot of tough problems. We've got a lot of test constraints in resources and budget, and the systems are highly complex. And so DOE is always evolving to handle those tough problems and finding solutions. So it's seeing these kind of examples that we see in real life is we try to do the best we can, right? And try to find a solution that works then, and then try to take what we learned and do it better the next time. And so proper planning and understanding those lessons learned and carrying them over will help you maximize the information that you gain, even in those difficult testing environments. So don't underestimate the importance of planning. It's so critical, and be sure to ask questions. That's the best part about being a statistician, is you can be the annoying person asking all the questions just to make sure you plan the best test possible. So with that, I think I'll leave it there and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Sarah. This was a very nice talk. I really enjoyed it, and I just want to say a couple of things about your talk. I really liked your one of the early slides where you talked about planning and the importance of planning. I always said in my class here at ASU, and in the MOOC class that we're doing, I talk about a planning process of 7 steps, and I noticed that your slide on planning basically covers all of those 7 steps, and I emphasize what I call pre-experimental planning, which is your first box. What is the problem? What are the factors, including the ranges and levels, and what's the response and how you're going to measure it? And I kind of learned this the hard way through helping people design experiments and looking at experiments that had been run by other people. And I was reminded by someone that years ago, there was a faculty member at Purdue named Charles Hicks. And Professor Hicks was in the mathematics department, and he actually taught a course on experimental design. And he actually published a very thin, small book on experimental design back in the 70s. And he used to tell people in his experimental design class that if you had 10 weeks to solve a problem, you should spend 8 weeks planning it, 1 week running it, and 1 week analyzing the data. And I really took that to heart, and I think you folks do as well. That the most important things that about the experiment usually get decided in that planning box, and if you don't put sufficient effort and sufficient energy and thought into that, the wheels can come off fairly quickly. and I've seen that on a lot of occasions, and I'm sure you've run into those kinds of situations too. We have some questions, and I think we have 3 or 4 questions, and let's try to get to those. And here is the first one. and I'm going to read the question. It says, I'm designing an experiment to develop a model that describes the effects of concentration of two ions in solution, respect kinetic reaction of a gel in the same solution. So in my design, I consider three factors: initial concentration of two ions and initial concentration of gel. And my experimentally, determined response variable is the viscosity of the solution under 3 steps of time. And so I'm guessing he says that the time would have a constant role. So that means you're observing this process at 3, let's say maybe equally spaced points in time. Maybe that's how I should interpret that. That's the way to develop a kinetic experiment: evolution of a property versus time. Consequently, the resulting model of that could determine viscosity as a function of concentration around the time. But what I need are the kinetic factors as a function of concentration. The kinetic factors are activation energy and pre-exponential factor and others. And the problem that I don't understand yet is, how do I describe my model in this way, having accounted that the kinetic factors are like derived factors of the entire curve, viscosity versus time. I mean, the 3 viscosity values, one for each time, give me just one value of EA and A of applying calculations after the experimentation. It seems to me that, and I'm not sure I have enough information to actually make this judgment here, but it seems to me this is a very similar kind of problem to what you were talking about there at the end, where you actually have a response variable that can be thought of as a curve. And I think maybe functional data analysis may be an approach for doing this. And so that would be something that I was just looking into. Sarah, does that answer sort of make some sense to you?
Yeah, I was actually going to say, I've seen an example or case study from a colleague as well in this kind of chemical region. They had more time steps. So I wonder if it's possible that they could have a few more time step responses so that they could have a better indication of what that response curve looks like. Because then I think that's a really good application for FDA. And I've seen that used in chemical industry.
Yeah.
For the derived factors, we've also seen that in some of our projects. And I tend to like to do the analysis with the derived factors if possible, but then you have to be careful about the orthogonality properties still hold. So do you have any other advice for that one? Because that's a case by case basis in my experience.
I'm not so sure I would worry that much about the orthogonality properties at that point, because if you're going to use a regression type model, it's going to account for that fairly nicely, I would think. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. The other thing that sometimes comes about in these experiments where you observe a response at different time periods is you get correlation between the responses, and that's almost another problem in itself. You run into those in clinical trial experiments. Where you have a patient that comes in and you measure something on that patient every month or every week or some time period. And so you get a laboratory analysis of some physical property of this patient every month or every week. And you have a whole sequence of these, and they're correlated because all of these measurements are made on one individual. So you have one individual being measured over and over and over again. And the typical approach there is to usually assume some type of correlation structure. And then there are some analyses that you can use that are sort of in the generalized linear models family that can use the assumptions about that correlation structure to do an analysis. And you can assume different correlation structures and see what happens, to find one that gives you the best explanation of of the problem. I don't know if you took the generalized linear models course when you were here, but I think we talk about that some in that course, and it sometimes is kind of a useful technique. This is a really interesting question, and I don't know that we fully addressed everything that the viewer wants, but I hope that this gets them started. And I do think that functional data analysis is probably something that's going to help in this. Okay, so here's another question. As a pharmaceutical formulation scientist, which is more beneficial for optimization of recipe and the manufacturing process parameters, factorial designs or mixture designs followed by d-optimal or box Bacon sets? I think that in a lot of these problems, what are really needed are what we call mixture process experiments. They are experimental designs that have two types of factors. One set of factors are the mixture components, and then the other set of factors are the process factors. And there are mixture process design techniques where you can combine both of these types of factors into a single mixture process experiment. There is a little bit of material about this in the textbook for this course in chapter 11, where we talk about mixture experiments. There is much more in the literature about this than is in my book. I am the author of another book on design that is all about response surfaces. And there's several chapters in that book on mixture experiments, including mixture process experiments. And there's a fairly substantial technical literature about this. And so I would suggest that looking into mixture process variable experiments would be a good place to start. The JUMP software package, by the way, does an excellent job of designing these experiments, and they are almost always optimal experiments. So you have to use optimal design techniques to create them, because usually there are constraints on the mixture components, and there may even be constraints on the process variables. And these types of experiments have been around a very, very long time. When I talk about them, I always tell students that even Shakespeare had mixture process variable experiments. And you say, Shakespeare? Well, remember the play Macbeth? Okay. In the opening part of Macbeth, remember what goes on? The Scottish lords are headed back to the castle after a long night of carousing, and they run into the three witches, right? And what are the witches doing? Well, they're making a witch's brew. And well, what goes into a witch's brew? Eye of bat, toe of newt, wart of frog, and water. So it's a 4-component mixture process. Okay, but they also have process variables. What are they doing? They are heating the witch's brew. Okay, so temperature is a process factor. They are stirring the mixing brew. So agitation is a second process factor, and they're chanting. Okay, and so that's a categorical process variable, chant or no chant, or which chant are they using? So there's a classic mixture process variable experiment, and you can use JUMP software to design these. And so I would suggest that you look into mixture process variable experiments before you sort of think about separating these into different components, because I have very often found that the optimal settings for the mixture components are very dependent upon the settings for the process factors, and you need to consider these jointly. So that's the way I would think about this. Sarah, do you have any comments on that?
I think you answered that way better than I could. So no.
Okay. what advice do you have for someone new to DOE working with a statistician to design a study? What things do people get wrong that drive statisticians nuts? Preconceived notions. I think a good experimental design statistician tries to get people to think outside the box. Yeah, we've always done it this way, but maybe we should think about some other ways to do it. And I thought the oxygen example that you gave early on in this in your presentation is a great example of that. We've always done it this way. We have these 4 profiles, and that's what we're going to use. And so, you know, being flexible, being, you know, willing to look at some different alternatives is really important. I think the other thing that goes wrong that tends to drive the experimental design people nuts is not executing the experimental plan correctly. Generally, when you design an experiment, you have a suggested run order, which is based on randomization. And sometimes people will go out, and when they start running the experiment, they will change the run order because they say, oh, gee, it's really inconvenient to change the temperature 8 times. So I'm going to do all of the low temperature runs first and all of the high temperature runs last. So they destroy the randomization sequence. And sometimes they never even tell the statistician that that's what they did. And it's why one of the things that I've always recommended is that when the experiment gets executed, make sure you have somebody that can watch to make sure that what's going on is what was planned, because sometimes it doesn't happen. One of the worst examples of this from my own experience, I used to work with some people that had a research facility, and I worked with their research folks. They were chemists and chemical engineers and people with that kind of background. And so we would design these experiments, and sometimes we could not run them in the facility that we had at that research center. They had to actually be run in the plant. And the plant was in some place completely different. You know, it wasn't co-located with the research center. And so what the folks at the research center would do is they would email the test matrix to the folks at the plant, and they would say, okay, well, you know, call us when it's done. Okay. And so, you know, some couple of weeks later, they'd get the data back, and we would analyze the data, and the results would sometimes be something completely different than what we anticipated. And we struggled to find out why. And after some detective work, we found out that was exactly what I described was going on, is that the folks at the plant would look at the test matrix and say, oh, it's ridiculous for us to change the temperature 8 times, because it takes a lot of effort to change the temperature 1 time. So we're going to do all the low temperature runs first and all the high temperature runs last. And that just creates problems with randomization. And, you know, as we've talked about in the course, when you don't randomize things properly, you sometimes get results that are not correct. So that's certainly one of the big things. Good question.
Yeah, can I chime in on that one too?
Sure.
Yeah. So what things that people get wrong? Wrong is a harsh word for me, but two pieces of advice. One is not treating your statistician as a member of the team, like as a colleague. So we've seen some things where I might be considered as sort of like an oversight person, or I'm sort of like on the end, you know, it's you against me. And I mean, no, we're here to help you, right? So having a collaborative experience and keeping us included in meetings, even if I'm not always specifically about the test design, but if there's information that gets shared that might be helpful for us to know. Like it's helpful for us to understand the system under test. So keeping us as part of the team is really important. And then the other one I mentioned in my talk was communication, but it goes a little bit both ways. Is so, there's a lot of jargon from statistics, and there's a lot of jargon from the subject matter experts who are helping. And so making sure that there's clear communication, everybody understands the language and the words and how they're being used is really important to avoid surprises. So if there's a word that we're using that you don't understand, ask us, because if you're working with a good statistician, they want to help you learn and explain things, right? But the reverse is also true. If we don't understand something, then we should also be questioning you and understand it. So keeping the lines of communication open so that we understand each other's language is really important to have a successful test.
Good points. Couple more questions. The question is, can we do optimization response surfaces even if the factor levels are not continuous? Okay, they're nominal. And yeah, you can, but the analyses are a little bit different because you're basically going to be relying on contour plots that only the responses only exist at certain test combinations, and the prediction profiler in JUMP can handle that. So yes, you can do that. And one more. Oh, and these are specifically for you, Sarah.
Okay.
How long was this project from, planning and sharing recommendations to the customer? Did you use any blocking techniques? And did you observe any multicollinearity among factors? So,
okay. Yeah, great. Okay, so first question. So we had two efforts. Each one was funded for a year. So we were working within that strict timeline. So a year for each effort. Blocking, interesting question. So we executed several experiments. Primarily what we used, we actually had split plot experiments. So I didn't highlight that in the case study because that was just going to be one thing too many, but we did have some hard or expensive to change variables. So we primarily relied on split plot designs in the experiment, primarily because we were in a lab setting. And while you can have issues with labs being inconsistent over time, especially in the first effort, we saw that they were actually very consistent. So especially on the second effort, blocking was less of a concern for us, but we did use split plot designs. And then multicollinearity among the factors. So I mentioned that we had the design constraints for some of the breathing variables. And so we definitely had multicollinearity in that first effort when we actually broke it down in terms of the continuous factors. But in the follow-on effort, what we actually did was broaden the scope. And so we didn't rely so much on what humans can do in their breathing conditions. We wanted to characterize the system across any potential. And so we eliminated the design region constraints so we could characterize performance. And then we used de-optimal design. So it minimized the amount of aliasing in the design. And so we didn't have to worry about multicollinearity because we designed it so that it wasn't completely orthogonal, but it was very close to it. Good
comment. That's the ends of questions, by the way. But I do want to point out that we do talk about split plot designs in the course. They're in course number 4, and there's an entire chapter in the textbook on designs that are multi-factor but do not have factorial type structure, and split plots are one of those. And so there's a fairly sizable chunk of material in the textbook on split plots. They do come up in the course, and JUMP does a really lovely job of handling split plot designs. And the other technique discussed in that chapter is something called nested designs or nested factors. And both of those are design techniques that are handled quite well in JUMP. Okay, so that's the end for today. The next Fireside Chat is Wednesday, September 8th. My guest is Jim Simpson, another person that has a lot of experience with experiments in the DoD world. And again, full disclosure, Jim is another one of my PhD students. that has gone out to be wildly successful. And information on the Fireside Chat topic and how to join in will be included in our Coursera course. Okay, with that, we're done for the day. Thank you for coming and hope you enjoyed it.